Hello, everyone. I'm Estelle Rogers, Chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law, and I will be your moderator today. We're thrilled to be presenting a very timely panel entitled Adapting Elections in a Pandemic, COVID-19 and Beyond. The panel is sponsored by the ABA Standing Committee on Election Law, Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the Coalition on Racial and Ethnic Justice, and co-sponsored by the Section of State and Local Government Law. The panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars on the COVID-19 pandemic. We are actively planning additional COVID-19 programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists. As an attendee, you should see a control panel with controls such as audio options, chat, raise hand, and Q&A. For the purposes of this webinar, we ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A, not through the chat. If you do not see these controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. We will address questions at the end of the panel, so you can submit them anytime. We will be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who has registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. Our panelists today are Nate Persily, James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford University Law School, Jacqueline de León, attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, Megan Wolf, the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, the Honorable Ellen Rosenblum, Attorney General of Oregon, who also happens to be the former Secretary of the American Bar Association, Jared DeMarinis, Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance of the Maryland State Board of Elections. I could give you longer biographies, but rather than spend the time, I'll let their presentations speak for themselves. They're very qualified. Just to set the stage for our program, on March 13th, 2 months ago exactly, I read that Louisiana was postponing its presidential primary. On March 14th, Georgia followed suit. Like many people interested in elections, I'm sure, this was my aha moment. 2020 was not going to be like any election year in living memory. But we have to make sure that whatever the challenges, eligible voters will have the chance to register and vote, and that they can be confident that the election will be free and fair. We're going to start off with Professor Persily, who's devoted a lot of time and thought to how to do this. Nate.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint, and so you'll see me as a small box on the screen. I'd like to say that in addition to my work as I was the senior research director of the Presidential the Presidential Commission on Election Administration about 6 years ago. But most of my work at Stanford has been particularly in the area of the internet and democracy as director of the Cyber Policy Center. But when the pandemic hit and its implications for elections became apparent, I sort of dropped all the work that I had been doing on disinformation, political advertising for this election, and put back on my hat as someone who works in the area of the nuts and bolts of elections. To start up with Charles Stewart at MIT, something called the Healthy Elections Project, which you can visit at healthyelections.org. But as we've seen in the primaries that have already been run, some that have been delayed, as well as elections around the world, the pandemic is posing a serious threat to elections. And so I'm going to talk about what the problems are and then what the potential solutions are. This is a much longer talk that you can see on YouTube that I've given elsewhere, and then I'll put on my Twitter page. But just to start with what the problem is, the problem is that we need to figure out a way for this election for states and localities to accommodate voters who are going to have to vote in ways that they are not accustomed to based on their past experience, all right? And so sizable shares of the population are going to need to vote in a different way. Now, the solutions are not that unfamiliar to you. We are going to need to move as many voters to mail as possible. And we are going to need to retrofit our polling places as much as possible to avoid risks to voters and poll workers. this is not as easy as people think. You cannot just take a state that has not had an experience with massive vote by mail and then overnight have everyone voting by mail, for example. In addition, we are not in the U.S. as familiar with retrofitting polling places to ensure social distance, and so this requires resources. It requires a lot of new effort on the part of the election officials and the voters. One thing I want to emphasize, though, because I think it's a complexity that often gets lost in this conversation, which is that the sort of paradigms of polling place voting and vote by mail are actually not a dichotomous choice. These are sort of poles on a continuum. And there are a lot of sort of options in the middle that different jurisdictions are experimenting with and had experimented with even before the pandemic hit. Most notably, the idea of getting a vote by mail ballot in the mail that you vote at home, but then can drop off at a facility where you could have your verification, your identification verified and the like. And so there's a lot of different options in the middle. But almost all jurisdictions are going to have some mix of the two of these, right? You're not going to have a complete transition to vote by mail in the states that don't have experience with it. And for reasons I'll explain, it's not even desirable to fully eliminate polling places in those jurisdictions that have had a history of having votes done that way. So those are the sort of thumbnail sketch of the solutions. What are the constraints that are and the obstacles that are in our path to achieve those kinds of massive changes? Well, first there's time and money. And I actually think both of these are of equal significance. People pay a lot of attention to the money issues, and rightfully so. Congress has appropriated $400 million in the original coronavirus stimulus package. We need at least 3 times that amount, if not more, in order to make those kinds of massive transitions, especially when local jurisdictions are tightening their belts across the board to deal with the recession that the coronavirus has spurred on. But as important, if not more important, is time, and we don't have much time left to plan. In the next 2 months, if not the next 6 weeks, all jurisdictions need to plan for what they are going to do in November. And we need time to prepare for the election. We need time to distribute the ballots. We need time for the voters to vote. And then we need more time for those who are in charge of the election to count ballots. An election in which half the votes, if not more, are cast by mail is a different kind of election than one where you can expect, say, a victor to be announced on election night. And we need patience, which is in incredibly short supply these days, to allow the election administrators to do their job. So beyond those 2 critical resources of time and money, there's also sort of people, places, and things that we need in order to pull off this election. And I should say, as I have an asterisk on this slide, that all of the same pressures that we are seeing with respect to adaptation to the virus outside of the election realm have analogous impacts when it comes to elections. And so people are taken out of commission, right? So the election offices, most of these folks are working from home right now. And so you don't have the kind of, the offices functioning in the ways that they normally do. But we need poll workers to staff these the polling places on election day. One of the things that Wisconsin did that was absolutely critical for them to pull off their election, as difficult as it was that the governor mobilized for the first time the National Guard to help out in polling places. We need governors around the country to do that now to help out these election officials in pulling off the upcoming primaries and the general elections that are coming down the pike, in part because there's massive shortages of poll workers. The average age of a poll worker in the US is between 65 and 70 years old. These are folks who are at greatest risk for the virus. And so there's a real loss of poll workers that are critical to pull off the election. Similarly, we're losing polling places. And so the number of facilities that can accommodate social distancing is small in and of itself. But then when you combine that with the fact that some schools senior living facilities, and firehouses are not going to be available for the election in the fall, then you have a massive shortage of polling places. Now, even for those areas which want to maintain substantial in-person voting, they are going to have to shift voters to vote by mail because they simply do not have the facilities that they need in order to make sure that people can vote with social distance. I've been working with dozens of jurisdictions already, and there's some that say they've lost 2/3 of the polling places that they expect usually to use for an election. And then finally, there are things that you need, machinery and the like. If you are a jurisdiction that hasn't had massive vote by mail, you have to have the ballot sorters, the extractors, the scanners, and the like, as well as in polling places, things as simple as PPE and hand sanitizer and the like. All of which, if you had many more months to plan, would not be difficult. But we are running into the same kind of supply chain challenges in the election realm that we're seeing with ventilators and face masks in general. And if all jurisdictions at once in August are making the requisite purchase orders for paper and the lucite protective shields and all kinds of other things that are necessary for this election, then several jurisdictions are going to be out of luck. As with everything dealing with election reform, accommodations for the virus also face structural impediments that we have in the system that we have to be aware of. The incredible decentralization and uneven distribution of resources and expertise that is a familiar feature of American election administration has particular bite when it comes to the dealing with the virus. Different jurisdictions have different needs, and different states have different roles to play in this balance of power between the state authorities and the localities. And so in some states, you're seeing the locality, different cities taking different initiatives, whether it's sending out mail ballot applications to different, to all their voters, or in some situations suggesting that they have the authority to send out actual absentee ballots to all of their voters. There are problems with the contracting and procurement process that are extant even beyond what the virus has posed. And then there are existing laws and regulations that simply need to be changed. For example, on who can be a poll worker and how you would, for example, accommodate mobilizing the National Guard in different types of polling places. And we can't leave out the fact that the political parties are extremely far apart on how to run this election. I will say that in my experience in working with election administrators, that the farther down you go, the less polarized it is. These are folks who are trying to literally pull off this election under incredible strain and with the limited resources that they have. And finally, there's the sheer unpredictability of the virus, and that we do not know what November or October is going to look like. And so there are those, some who are preparing now, as I think is critical, and others who are sort of praying that they don't need to make the massive shifts that right now look like need to be made. So we don't know the extent to which we're going to be under the conditions of social distancing that we are right now. And so, they're trying to plan for the worst, but hope for the best. I should say that, the trends that we're seeing that are going to be turbocharged by this election toward vote by mail were trends that were long in the offing. So you can see that every year we've had an increase in the number of people who are voting outside of traditional polling places. My guess is we'll see somewhere on the range of 60% or so, maybe 50% who are voting by mail, another third who are voting early in this election. But as you know, that's not uniform across the country. The Western states have been predominantly vote by mail. California has now announced that it's going to do all vote by mail in this election. That's not exactly what it's going to do. There's going to be some polling places, but every voter is going to get a ballot. There's obviously pushes to do that. Places, Oregon, Washington, Colorado have already done that. Arizona has had about 2/3 to 3/4 of its voters vote by mail historically, but much less vote by mail in the East Coast and in the South, some of which require excuses for absentee ballots and some which don't. as you can see, and this is, sorry for the complexity of the slide, but I just wanted to highlight the battleground states. Places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and North Carolina have had, under 6% vote by mail. And then this is the 2008 election. And so to make the change is going to require a massive shift in resources and in voter behavior. And I just want to, this is obviously a complicated slide, but that's my point, is just to show you that vote by mail is not a simple process if you haven't done it before. It requires a lot of important work in dealing with the Postal Service, which, as we know, is also under incredible strain right now and under funding, having funding problems. You need to make sure your voter address lists that you have in order to contact voters. You need to make sure it's not enough that you mail every voter a ballot. You have to make sure you mail the right ballot to every voter, since all of us are in quite different, overlapping jurisdictions because of multiple districts and the like. And so it is a complicated process, and there is obviously quite, a lot of people who criticize vote by mail. The fraud concerns I don't think are terribly significant, though it's obviously ones that are being talked about by politicians. But there is, concern that, the people who have voted by mail historically have been older, have been whiter, have been more educated and the like. And one thing you have to think about when thinking about vote by mail is how the economic dislocation due to the recession following the virus is going to have an effect on people's social mobility. So that in the next few months, we should expect millions of people to be moving from their traditional address, and a vote by mail election is only as good as the addresses to which you mail people the ballots. And so therefore we need to create safe polling places, right? We need poll workers, we need more polling places, and we need to get all of the kind of equipment that is necessary in order to pull off safe polling places. This requires some kind of sort of innovative steps, like alternative ways of voting through curbside voting, taking a number in order to vote as opposed to waiting in long lines, right? We need massive education and outreach to voters about, as these polling places are consolidated. One of the things we know as political scientists is that polling place consolidation has a measurable impact on voter turnout, and we should see massive changes in that regard. And we need to lengthen the voting period to make sure that voters are able to vote over a longer period of time. That's in states that have early voting. We need to push voters into those early voting days as opposed to election day. Now, it can be done. And one of the things that we see from South Korea, which just held its election, right, is what an extreme sort of accommodation would look like, where they had several steps where they would even take the temperature of voters as they came into the polling place. There was hand sanitizer. Everybody was gloved and masked as they voted. Even election observers were scanned as they went into the polling place. And then, as you can see, voters in masks would vote their ballot. We even had they had in South Korea a separate section for people who did either test positive or have a fever to vote. And so this can be done. They were able to pull off their election. But as I said, the most important resource is time. We need more time to vote. We need more time to administer the election, more time to count the votes, and more time to announce the results. And in particular, we need the media to try to, at least the responsible media organizations, to realize that an election which is done predominantly by mail is a different kind of election, where we should not expect the victor to be announced on election night. We need to spend several days to make sure we get it right instead of getting it done fast. That is part of the motivation behind this new initiative we have at Stanford and MIT, the Healthy Elections Project, to try to make these massive transitions before November. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nate. That's certainly a lot of food for thought. So let's turn now to Jacqueline de León, who's an attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, who I think can amplify some of the pluses and minuses of voting by mail and anything else she wants to talk about. Jacqueline.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline de León, a staff attorney with Native American. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about the drawbacks of vote by mail in the Native American community, but want to sort of emphasize at the outset that increased vote by mail is generally good. So let's jump right in. think that should work. So I think the quick takeaways here is that increased vote by mail is great, that all vote by mail is not great, and we still have to provide safe in-person voting options, especially in rural and high poverty areas. And this is a point that Nate just made as well. And this is because vote by mail is not a panacea. Lower income and minority groups tend to move more often and suffer from increased homelessness, so they have trouble receiving a ballot. There's no election day registration with vote by mail. Persons with disabilities need touch screens and audio ballots, and language assistance is unavailable. But I think what I'm going to do is really focus on Native Americans today. And that's because it's kind of a slam dunk case. And that's because it's impossible for Native Americans throughout the country to vote by mail. And the bottom line is because Postal Service does not deliver mail to their homes. So this safe option of voting from mail that sort of everybody feels, a lot of people feel comfortable with, is simply not an option in Native American homes. And that's because in the rural areas that many Native Americans live, the post office doesn't deliver. Their homes are either unmarked or they use what's called a non-traditional address, so something other than 123 Main Street. This is not a situation that's unique to Native Americans. It's prevalent throughout Indian country. For example, general delivery, rural routes and box numbers, highway contract route and box numbers, post office box only delivery, that can extend to rural people throughout America. And so they may not be receiving a ballot in their home. So if you can't receive a ballot at your home, if you can't conveniently drop it off and then pick it up, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have some type of interaction. But it's also going to be unreasonably difficult throughout Indian country for Native Americans to pick up a ballot. And that's because even if they have a home or if they're staying under a roof, it's unreasonably difficult for them to get mail. There's a housing crisis throughout Indian country. It's simply not uncommon to have 15 people sharing a home and moving from home to home, which is called, couch surfing. So people are worried about overstaying their welcome because they're there just on the benevolence of a family member or friend. And so they are going from home to home. And this is severe. So in 2017, for the 11,000 members of the Northern Arapaho tribe in Wyoming, there were just 230 reservation homes. That's 48 people per home. I cannot stress enough how shocking and unacceptable that is, but also how that will translate into disenfranchisement, because people simply are not regularly staying in one place. They are, however, usually staying within one voting district, right? They're staying within a reservation. They're not necessarily going out and about beyond the reservation, but they aren't staying under one roof. And so when you think about the point of contact between getting a ballot, there's not going to be that consistent point of contact in a home. And so to further emphasize this point, on the Navajo Nation, between 42,000 and 85,000 Navajo people would be homeless if they weren't couching surfing. So this isn't a small problem. Another issue with vote by mail in Native American communities is the difficulty obtaining a signature match. So often, in order to verify a ballot at the end, after somebody's voted, you sign the back of the envelope, and at that point, the election official will check the signature. Well, where the election official's pulling that signature, if, for example, you've registered online, is from the DMV. So they're pulling it from a driver's license. And with Native Americans, many don't have driver's licenses. And that's because driver's license DMVs are just unreasonably far. For example, in Standing Rock, people have to travel 131 miles round trip just to get a driver's license. So I think kind of what the culmination of all these barriers are saying is that Native Americans are living in a reality that is very different than what the average American is living in. You know, they're living in homes that are unmarked. They're living in overcrowded homes and moving from home to home, and they don't possess a driver's license. And so all three of those things are going to mean that it is incredibly difficult for them to cast a ballot through the mail. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, then how do Native Americans cast a ballot? Or how do they, sorry, not cast a ballot, how do they pick up their mail, and how do they operate? Well, the truth is they use post offices, right? And they use PO boxes. But post office system is not a good system to substitute at-home vote by mail. And that's because post offices still require a substantial amount of travel in Native American communities. And so we're not talking about, you know, 10 miles, we're talking about 20 to 50 miles, hours of travel on a dirt road in November is not exactly an accessible post office site. And it's also gonna require interaction once you get into that post office. So you're gonna end up talking to somebody anyway. So in the time of COVID, we're not necessarily gonna be getting the type of safe protections that other vote by mail individuals would get. There also, at the end of the day, it would be a rural post office that an individual would be going to, and rural post offices simply are open for limited hours. So for example, the post office in this picture is from Montana, and today it was open from 8 a.m. to noon. So it doesn't have the same type of accessibility that you might think your post office might have, or non-rural post offices might have, and they have especially limited weekend hours if they have those at all. That means picking up mail if you have a job is going to be extremely difficult to do. So often Native Americans go a very long time before they pick up their mail. PO boxes also require a fee, and they're also limited in number. So what does that mean? It means that in Native American communities, multiple people, I'm talking dozens of people, are sharing a PO box. Often somebody, in order to minimize that travel burden, is gonna travel and pick up all the mail that's in the PO box, do a mail run, come home, and distribute that mail to their community members. You might just give the mail to somebody's sister that they see and say, hey, you know, drop this off to your sister next time you see them. So it's this really inexact way of picking up and dropping off mail. And there's long lapses between picking up and dropping off mail. And the truth is that Native Americans could go an entire election cycle without interacting with their mail at all. And finally, a problem that comes within Native American communities and rural post offices generally, so not just Native Americans, is there's really circuitous mail routes, non-intuitive mail routes. So when you drop off your ballot, it's going to ping around major cities before it gets back to your own local election official. So for example, voters in Navajo return their ballot, and instead of going straight to the Coconino County elections official and flag staff, it's routed through Phoenix. As a consequence of that circuitous mail route, it's going to take a really long time for that mail to be delivered. So instead of, say, the 2 days or 3 days that it may take somebody mailing their ballot from a city to get to their county official, or even less, it will take a week plus for the same person's mail or another rural voter's ballot to get to their election official. And the problem with that is that it's an inexact science. So nobody will know, you know, the rural voter simply won't know when they turn in their ballot whether or not it's ultimately going to be timely if an election requires that the ballot be received by election day. So what can we do? You know, unfortunately, this is a trying time, and you know, tribes are seeing the brunt of COVID-19. There's record outbreaks, higher per capita outbreaks on the Navajo Nation right now. Tribes and county officials are scared. And so it's an understandable, I think, thing to be wary about in-person voting. Unfortunately, I think as we've seen, without in-person voting options, Native Americans simply won't have the option to exercise their right to vote. And so we have to maintain some type of in-person voting option in Native American communities. You know, the first order of business, if there is a Native American community, is to consult with the tribes, right? They're gonna know which locations are best for polling, which locations are best to maintain social distancing, and also use Native community poll workers. And that's so that you don't introduce more individuals into the community from outside of the community, and more chance of increasing exposure to the virus. And these type of accommodations seem perhaps obvious, but unfortunately are not often exercised. So county officials may not sort of think to themselves that Native Americans are qualified or a good pool to pull from for poll workers, but election officials should. We should think that Native Americans are qualified American citizens and can act as poll workers. As Nate said, you know, we have to try and exercise and make in-person polling options as safe as possible. So early voting options to minimize crowds, curbside votings, PPE and distance, set aside times for vulnerable and elder populations, and you have to offer language assistance. There are in many Section 203 language barriers throughout Indian country, language assistance is required throughout Indian country because especially the elder voters only speak their native languages and often are not literate. And so in-person language assistance is necessary for that individual to vote. The last is mobile stations and registration. And the reason that I bring that up is because Native American communities can be quite large. And this is not the point of this presentation, but it is the case that it is extremely difficult for Native Americans to reach their in-person polling locations anyway. So we're talking 40, 50, up to 150 miles in Nevada for individuals to reach an in-person polling location. And that's frankly outrageous and unjust, but there are, you know, I think that utilizing novel solutions like mobile voting stations and registration can help cut down on some of those distance barriers. For the Native Americans that can vote by mail, I think we should encourage them to vote by mail. There are some Native Americans in tribal communities that do have postal service or who may choose to use the P.O. box option in order to try and receive their ballot on time. I think that because of the circuitous mail routes, allowing for election day postmarks for ballots to be considered timely is really important. Increasing ballot drop boxes so no voter has to go further than 20 miles is helpful. Paying for postage and providing ample notice to the voter to cure signature match issues and allow for ballot pickup and drop off for others. And the last is especially critical because of what we see in P.O. boxes, as I mentioned, is that it's unreasonably difficult to pick up mail and to receive mail. And so voters have to go travel 50 miles to pick up their mail, and they are often picking up mail for people that are sharing P.O. boxes, and they may inadvertently touch a ballot. If we criminalize inadvertently touching ballots, you're gonna end up criminalizing people that are simply doing the best that they can in a bad situation. And finally, I'll just highlight sort of how some vote by mail states like Washington have dealt with their native populations. So for example, Washington is all vote by mail state. they did not see an increase in turnout among Native Americans when they transitioned to vote by mail. So, it's often touted as a success story, vote by mail, but that's often in urban areas, not necessarily in the rural areas. So turnout remains low in Native American communities. This year, in response to that turnout, Washington implemented a Native American Voting Rights Act. And what it does is it allows tribes to designate buildings that tribal members can use to register. So if, for example, they're moving from home to home, they can utilize that address to register. They can also pick up and drop off their ballots at that tribally designated building within their community. So thinking about these type of novel solutions could be applicable here, requires consultation with tribal governments, and is a good way to integrate solutions to allow everybody to vote by mail in this trying time. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Next, we will hear from Megan Wolf, who's administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. And in addition to the Wisconsin election that a lot of us read about a few weeks ago, there was actually one yesterday. So we'd love to hear about that too, Megan.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here. And to the fellow panelists, this has been really an interesting opportunity that I very much appreciate. So thank you. So I am Megan Wolf. I'm the chief election official for the state of Wisconsin and the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission. And our agency is the agency responsible in the state of Wisconsin for overseeing elections. And a lot of our responsibilities hinge on the training of local election officials, voter outreach and providing information, as well as technology. So before the COVID crisis, if I was talking to you, it probably would have been about cybersecurity, technology, mis and disinformation, all the things that were really hot topics in elections have now sort of been not put aside. We're certainly still focusing on those things, but we've had to adjust very rapidly to some significant changes in terms of what was already a pretty full plate for this year. So one of the things before I get started talking about our April election is that, many of you are probably familiar with how elections operate across the country, but I don't think people always understand or appreciate just how different elections are run in every single state in our nation. So every state has their own election laws and procedures that can be incredibly different than even a neighboring state or another state of their size. And so how we run elections is just so different, and Wisconsin is no exception. As a matter of fact, we're probably one of the most different states in terms of how we operate elections. There really aren't other states that are similar to us, and these are an important part of our story. So first, our commission operates as a commission. So we have a bipartisan panel of 6 political appointees from the majority and the minority party that oversee our agency. They then appoint the administrator, me, as the chief election official for our state, and I'm required by law to remain nonpartisan, as is all my staff. This is very different from over 40 of the states in the country where elections are operated by an elected official. So the chief election official in most 40 states is the Secretary of State, or maybe a lieutenant governor or an elected official. And so that's one of the ways that we're really different. And probably the biggest thing that we do that's different than states is we are the most decentralized election administration system in the country. And what that means is most other states operate elections at the county level. So that means that they may have 50 to 100 local election officials, probably an elections department, professional staff. In the state of Wisconsin, we operate at the municipal level. And so that means each city, town, and village in the state of Wisconsin has a local election official in addition to our counties. So we have 1,850 local election officials in each of those municipalities, plus 72 counties, bringing us to a total of 1,922 local election officials that are able to sort of prescribe how they apply those laws to their jurisdiction and their polling places. Another thing about our agency is, we have no ability to change the law. So we can't change dates, we can't change deadlines, we can't change procedures that are outlined in the law. All those have to happen through either an act or an order of the courts or an act of the legislature. We have no discretion to make those changes. We're really there just to implement the law, to be the practitioners of the law along with the local election officials. Whatever hand it is that we're dealt, we're charged to implement those things in accordance with those decisions. And we were dealt quite a hand as we headed into the April election. So to set the stage a little bit about the April 7th election. So first of all, in Wisconsin, what was on the ballot? So we heard a lot about the primaries happening around the country, and our election was actually very different than those two. We do like to be different. And so our primary was more than just the presidential preference, which in a lot of states is more or less a political party nominating process. It's not even always an official state election in some of those other states. It's conducted by the party. In the state of Wisconsin, we conduct the presidential preference, plus there were a lot of other contests on our ballot. So every April, we have our nonpartisan contests up for election. So these are things like judicial elections, including our state Supreme Court, and then all of those local offices. So all of the local decision makers at the county and the local level were also on the ballot for the April election. So in an April election around the state, there can be more than tens of thousands of contests and candidates on our April election. And one of the decisions that was cited by those who can make the decisions about the dates and deadlines of elections was that now is a time more than ever that local leadership was really needed within our communities, and to delay the election could have potentially caused vacancies in many of those positions that didn't carry over. And so that, helps to differentiate too, why in some places maybe it seemed like it was an easier decision to be able to move some of those presidential preferences, because again, those were nominating processes held by the party rather than actual elections like ours. The other thing that I think really helps set the stage too is that ballots for our April 7th election, they had to go out by state and federal law at the end of February. So at the end of February, our election was well underway. So that last week of February, our election was well underway. Ballots had been sent to the voters. Everything had already sort of been solidified in terms of how that election was going to operate. Our first stay-at-home order in the state of Wisconsin did not happen until March 12th. And so you're talking about weeks, almost 3 weeks after our election had started, that sort of the rules started to change and the conditions changed in the middle of that process. Many laws and processes were challenged through litigation after that stay-at-home order as well. So most all of our laws, as they related to moving the date of the election, moving deadlines for things like voter registration, absentee ballot requests, witness requirements. So absentee ballots in Wisconsin are required to have a witness sign them. And then things like postmark and when those ballots could be returned if they were cast by mail. All of those things were challenged in multiple litigations in the weeks before the election. And as many of you know, the US Supreme Court and the state of Wisconsin Supreme Court both ruled in the evening prior to the election, changing some of those requirements, some of the ways that voters were expected to interact with the process in terms of witness requirements and in terms of when their ballot had to be received or postmarked. All of those things were literally changed in the hours prior to our actual election happening. So ultimately, where did we land? So those were sort of the stage that was set, the hand that we were dealt. As election practitioners, we always again look at what can we do and where did we land? So ultimately, our state went from a state that typically casts about 6% of our ballots by mail. And that actually is kind of high for some elections. An election like the April presidential preference, you'd even see lower than that. We're typically very much an in-person voting state. Our state always ranks as one of the highest in terms of turnout, but that turnout is in person. We've had a long tradition of election day registration. We find that over 80% of our voter records were created using election day registration. So vote by mail was not really something that was familiar to most Wisconsin voters. And so you would typically see less than 6% of people casting their ballot by mail. In the April 7th, 2020 election, over 80% of voters cast their ballot by absentee. Now we're still working on reconciling our data, so I don't have everything in terms of how many were by mail versus in-person absentee, but we know that it was at least a huge increase from 6% to nearly 80% of our ballots being cast by mail. And this literally happened overnight. That's kind of a catchphrase, but this literally is a shift that happened for our state overnight in terms of voter behavior and in terms of having to create any sort of infrastructure to support that, because that was not something that was previously utilized. Another fact is this presidential preference election on April 7th had the second highest turnout for a presidential preference election in the state of Wisconsin's history. And so when you look at the turnout for the presidential preference in the last two, this falls right in between those ranges. So if you look at 2012, 2016, and 2020, this falls right between those two elections, with 2016 being about 2.1 million, and this election being about 1.5 million voters that ultimately participated. We also saw that there was no spike in cases of COVID across our state due to the election. So there's been multiple analytics conducted on this. There were some voters that were shown to have some type of correlation, either being that they voted on election day or they served as poll workers, but the Department of Health Services has ultimately concluded that there's no way to be able to attribute that to the causation of voting. There's no way to say that those people didn't interact with someone else or some other process, but there was no spike that was seen throughout the state. Now, what did we do to kind of get to those ultimate results? How did we land there? So we had to do a lot. And again, we had to adjust this overnight. And, one of the things and the challenges that we found was just things like supplies. There were not supplies in the supply chain to be able to purchase. Even with additional federal funds, state funds, there was nothing that could be bought in terms of sanitizer, in terms of, some of the isopropyl wipes that were needed to clean voting equipment screens and other touch screens so that they could remain operational. All masks, gloves, those were all things that were not able to purchase. And so our local election officials, even more so, were finding a challenge there. And so we set out to find these things on their behalf. We sourced across the country to try to find these things. And ultimately, we could not identify a source of things like sanitizer to ensure that our polling places had what they needed. And we ended up having to contract with a local distillery to have some alcohol-based liquid solution made to be able to distribute to those local election offices. We also worked with our state emergency management center and ultimately were able to find enough of that sanitation solution. We found that even spray bottles were in short supply. So once we found the sanitizer, we didn't have bottles to put it in. And so we had to look again across the country to find spray bottles so that the clerks and the voters could actually utilize the supplies. We ended up buying enough pens so that each voter had their own pen to be able to sign the poll book and to vote their ballot without having to share. We sent each polling place things like social distancing signs that we had printed. We sent them painter's tape so that they could mark 6-foot distancing on the floor and hang the signs. lines. And so, just getting supplies and then getting them out to 1,850 localities to ensure that they had what they needed was a huge undertaking, as well as things like envelopes. So imagine if you're a local election clerk and you've planned for 6% of your ballots in a low turnout April election to be sent by mail, and now you're asked for over 80%. We had to buy envelopes. We had to have envelopes printed, which is something that really relies on experienced vendors and certain paper stock. And we found that there were shortages in the paper supply chain. And again, we had to source around the country to find enough envelopes to be able to have them printed to keep our absentee process running as well. Another thing that I know Nate already touched on is that we did end up utilizing our National Guard. So we sent out a survey to our local election officials, so to all 1,850 of them in the weeks before the election, asking them about if they had enough poll workers to staff their polling places. And we heard, based on those survey results, that they were experiencing a shortage of over 7,000 poll workers across the state. Now, in a general election or an election like April, you would see about 20,000 poll workers in our state, and they were expressing a shortage of about 7,000. Some of those were prior to decisions that were made about consolidating polling places and other things, but ultimately the National Guard was able to supply about 2,500 poll workers. And an important part about that story is these were all people that served in their home communities in plain clothes. So they were recruited from the counties in which they live. So they were voters, neighbors, friends, family, community members that were serving at the polls in plain clothes. But we don't typically train poll workers at the state. That's something that happens at the local level. So we also found ourselves having to put together an entire online training curriculum. So once the National Guard was called onto duty on that Sunday before the election, that we were able to train all of them to be able to serve in the roles as poll workers. They were then deployed to the local communities to train with them directly on the Monday before the election, and then of course to serve on election day at the polls. We utilized that model in yesterday's election too, only on a much smaller scale because it was a congressional vacancy that only spanned 700 municipalities rather than 2,000. And so that was one of the big things that we did as well, is making sure that they had enough staffing. And then of course, technology changes. And this is something that, I still haven't quite found the words to express the changes that had to be made to our technological systems to adjust for this. When you're talking about 6% absentee being issued through the statewide voter registration database, that's a human-driven process. You can pretty easily look at the amount of requests that have come into your system versus the amount of envelopes that you've put out. But when you're dealing with 80%, when you're dealing with over 1 million absentee ballots statewide, it now becomes a technologically driven process because you do not have the option to use your eyes to double check that you sent out 10,000 ballots if you're the city of Milwaukee or somewhere else. And so the technology to keep up with the pace on systems that weren't really utilized before, the absentee ballot request feature on our website through the state, and then the issuing process for the clerks, it literally required our staff to work around the clock. And that's not an exaggeration, for about 3 weeks. Where we were sitting next to servers, making changes to them as it was needed to make sure that things continued. And so, we hear some of the stories that resulted from lines in literally 2 of our municipalities in the state of Wisconsin. And again, we have 1,850. And those pictures that were taken were from 2 polling places out of about 2,000 polling places. So overall, it was just, I think a remarkable effort, and that effort and any success is really attributed to those local election officials. Every step of the way, no matter what was dealt to them, they found a way to be resourceful, they found a way to be resilient, and they found a way to provide what they needed to under the constructs of the law and any of the court decision rulings. And so, I think ultimately, as election practitioners, again, we're handed whatever the cards are that we're handed through legislation, through the court system, and our job is to try to implement those the best we can given those constructs. And so, I think that there's a lot of questions, and nobody wanted to be operating sort of under those circumstances. But those are the things that we faced, the challenges that we faced, and we certainly learned a lot that we can do to change our process, to adjust our technology as we head into August and November, so that if this pattern of voter behavior does continue, that again, we're able to keep pace with that and meet voters' expectations and allow them to interact with the process safely. Oh, another thing quickly I should have brought up is we also worked really closely with a public health official throughout this process to create documentation and basically rebuild our manuals, our checklists, our procedures for election day using public health guidance. So how do you do things like curbside voting safely? How do you run a polling place safely? How do you do a witness of an absentee ballot safely if somebody's in quarantine? And so we did work with a public health official to redevelop all of those guidance documents to include those public health practices as well. Because while we know a lot about election law at the Elections Commission, we're not public health officials. And so that was a huge collaboration to make sure that we were able to ensure that the practices adapted to the current crisis. And
Thank you, Megan. That's a lot of material. I'm sure we're going to have some more questions about that. You probably felt like a ping pong ball being battered back and forth by various courts too. So the time frame is kind of challenging. Next, we're going to hear from Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum of Oregon, who's going to talk about the experience of Oregon as a vote-by-mail state for many years.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you for having me. You mentioned that I had been the secretary of the American Bar Association, which is true, but I'm also very proud that I've been the chair of the section of state and local government law, which is one of the co-sponsors today. And so I really want to thank you for inviting the section to co-sponsor this with you. So I guess I'm kind of the cheerleader today for vote by mail. But I want to just say that I appreciate so much all of the speakers who've preceded me, and especially thank you so much to Jacqueline for educating me about some really important issues that I'm going to be following up on in my state, although I do possibly have some responses, but very, very important. And Megan, what an amazing story. Congratulations. And your distillery story is about the most clever one I've heard yet. So a lot of real ingenious people have obviously been working in Wisconsin. And I'm from Illinois, so I'm particularly proud of my former neighboring state. So before, I wanted to, before I lose it, and it looks like I just lost it, in a way, I don't want to sound defensive, but I want to respond to a couple things that Nate mentioned earlier, and these might also be somewhat responsive to Jacqueline before I get into more of the nitty gritty about the Oregon experience. But there was a mention that vote by mail is only as good as your current address, which of course is true. But in Oregon, you can update your voter registration up to 8 p.m. on election day, and you can still cast a ballot. If you do wait that long to do so, you have to pick up your ballot at the county elections office. So that's going to rule out, obviously, some people who are way out in the rural parts of the state or on the reservations. I also wanted to mention, and I think this also speaks to Jacqueline's point, that we have specific provisions for voting when you don't have an address, voting when you're homeless, because we believe everyone has a right to vote in Oregon, of course. Voters must, and here's what our rules and law provide. Voters must provide a residence address on the voter registration form, but this address may be any definable location in the county that describes their physical location. So this could be a shelter, it could be a park, it could be a motorhome, or it could be another identifiable location. The mailing address of that person who is homeless or who resides where mail service is unavailable can be the office of the county clerk. Voters can pick up their ballot at the county elections office. So again, obviously involves some travel, could be difficult, but nevertheless, we have tried to think of everything. And I'm sure there's plenty of things that we still have to consider. So this is not necessarily a pitch for, every state to have pure vote by mail by November. That's probably not advisable and probably impossible, but nevertheless, it could be doable. And we want to make sure that you're aware of all the different ways that we have kind of worked through the problems over the years. We've had a lot more time to do that than a state that's currently still in a pretty much of a traditional go to the polls format. But keep in mind that even though there's only 5 states that have pure vote by mail for all elections, and that includes, of course, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Hawaii, and Utah. So those are the 5 states. But every state has absentee ballots, right? Some of them have no excuse absentee ballots, which means you don't have to have any reason really why you want an absentee ballot. And more people, of course, are obtaining those so that they don't have to go to the polls. And second, there are the states then that do require some reasons, like you're actually going to be out of state at the time of the election. But many, many states now have participated in various iterations of vote by mail. So it's not a brand new concept. It is a different culture when you have pure vote by mail, but I think that we've all not only entered into that culture in various ways, but we kind of need to under the circumstances. We're in a pandemic. We're in a whole new world. I mean, look at teleworking. Teleworking, a lot of our offices had maybe 4% teleworking and now have 95%. And guess what? It's working. Not for everyone, but it's pretty remarkable. All you have to do is read the New York Times yesterday. You can see the article about that. So this is going to work, but we're going to have to set our minds to it, and we're going to have to do some things in a hurry much more quickly than we probably would have otherwise. And there will be those states that will decide that it's too much to do, certainly by November, but maybe by the following election. So let's get moving on it. And let me tell you a little bit about what we do here. First of all, we can track our ballots. So we can find out where they are in the system once we put them in the mail. We go to oregonvotes.gov/myvote. And my husband was telling me about how he was so excited about being able to track his ballot. And then when he was able to download that he had voted. Now, I haven't actually voted yet because I wanted to save my ballot to show it to you so that you could see what we get in the mail: official election ballot, vote and return promptly. And the thing I'm most proud of, you probably can't see it too well, but it says right here, U.S. postage paid. That is brand new. This is an historic document. It's the first time that we've ever had postage paid. It's a fabulous, fabulous thing, especially right now where people maybe can't get out to go buy stamps. So you don't have to buy a stamp. It's postage paid by the state. That took a while. It actually didn't pass a couple of times, but finally it did. And it was, it's kind of fun. It was a lot of the younger people, the millennials who wanted, they're like, well, we don't really buy stamps. So like, yeah, we get it. So we make it so that everybody's comfortable. They don't have to go, no excuse, right? So we've had vote by mail in Oregon for 20 years. This is the 20th anniversary. It was November 7th, 2000, that Oregon became the nation's first all vote by mail state. Here's how we got there. The use of vote by mail was first approved on a limited basis by our legislature in 1981. So 19 years before that. So it's all, we're talking about 40 years here. And so you might be saying, well, yeah, of course they've got vote by mail. They've got it all figured out. Well, we can help. And yes, it's taken time to get where we are today, but we think it can be done more quickly, given what we now know. So beginning in the year 2000, primary and general elections have been conducted exclusively by mail. I actually remember going to the polling place down the street, and I walk by it and I kind of miss it, but not enough that I want to go back to those days. Voters who are registered as of the 21st day before an election are mailed a ballot 2 to 3 weeks before the election, giving them time to research the issues or candidates. People love to have that opportunity to do that. And what we have that a lot of other states I realize don't have is something called the voter's pamphlet. This is actually sent out a month before the election, and it gives you all the details of every single election that you are going to be voting in. And it has arguments for and against. It has the ballot measures. We're a state that really loves our initiative and referendum process. In fact, that's how we got vote by mail. 70% of the voters of Oregon voted for vote by mail in the year 2000. So get the voters pamphlet, get the packet here, and they really do make it easy. They make sure that you see that you have to sign the envelope. If you don't sign the envelope, it's not accepted. It's not an official ballot. Why is that so important? Because that's essentially our polling book. It's the equivalent of the polling book, right? Because our election officials match the signature on the envelope with the signature that's on file at the county clerk's office. And that is done very carefully. It is done by at least 2 individuals for every ballot to make sure that the signatures match. And if they don't, you're notified so that you can have the opportunity to challenge the determination and still vote, hopefully, if that gets worked out. So this is my ballot. This is my secrecy sleeve here. And where is it? Uh-oh, I hope it's in here. Yes, here it is, secrecy sleeve. So everything is maintained confidential. And keep in mind that I know we're not spending a lot of time talking about security today, although as was pointed out, that used to be the main topic, but it's still so critical. And in Oregon and in vote by mail states, I believe all of them, we don't have any connection between our ballots and the internet. Zero, okay? The internet doesn't exist for purposes of our elections as far as the ballots go. We do have a system, it's called Clear Ballot, at least in Multnomah County, different counties, because as was noted, the county clerks run the elections, can use different systems, but we have one called Clear Ballot that we're very pleased with, and we are reasonably confident that we have secure elections. We certainly don't have hacking in the traditional sense. Obviously, we have to maintain the security of the ballots, the paper ballots themselves, and those are kept in boxes, secure in the county clerk's offices for purposes of if the need arises for recount or anything to that effect. In Oregon, we also have something called Oregon Motor Voter, automatic voter registration. So I wanted to put in a plug for that. The Oregon Motor Voter Registration Law took effect 4 years ago, making Oregon the first state in the nation to implement automatic voter registration. So what that means is when you're 16 years old, even though you can't vote yet, you get to register to vote when you get your driver's license. So how cool is that? Of course, you can also register to vote in the other usual ways, online voter registration or paper registration. Is vote by mail a success? In Oregon, absolutely. Oregon has the most convenient voting system in the country. Since we've adopted vote by mail, we have consistently ranked as a national leader in voter turnout. In our November 2018 general election, there was 67.8% turnout. That was 2018, so not a presidential election. In November 2016, it was 80% turnout. And the numbers are very similar all the way around. Do we have some concerns about fraud? Very minimal. My office handles election fraud, which is one of the reasons that I felt that I wanted to get more involved in this issue as we are in a presidential election year. And as a matter of fact, I'm on the ballot. I forgot to mention that I am on the ballot, but this is not a political event. So just thought I'd toss that out. I'm running for a 3rd term as Oregon Attorney General. I'm very excited about that. But as far as the fraud concerns, I don't want to minimize those, but I will say they are truly minimal compared to what you hear. We won't go into that. But we do have, as I said, county election officials trained in signature verification matches. And we have my office and the Secretary of State's office, which does the initial investigation and then turns cases over to us if they determine that it warrants a criminal investigation. So as an example, we've had a few cases, but very few, involving household members voting, forging signatures of another family member, those types of things. College students who are away, family members deciding to take advantage of their absences to fill out their ballots and such. That is a rare occurrence, and we have handled those quickly and I think well. So with that, Estelle, I will conclude so that you can move on, and perhaps we can have some time for Q&A if you have more questions about the Oregon experience. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And our last panelist will be Jared DeMarinis. Jared is the Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance in the Maryland State Board of Elections, and it's sort of the polar opposite of the Oregon experience. Maryland just had a vote by mail election, and they had to ramp it up very quickly, so we'll hear about how that happened.
Yes, thank you, Estelle, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's been very interesting so far. Yes, we just had an election on April 28th. It was a special general election for a congressional seat. We sent out nearly 500,000 ballots. Our turnout was 32%. It was a vote by mail election. We only had 1,000 people show up on election day to vote in person at 3 in-person voting locations. So as you can see, it was almost 100% vote by mail. We had 6 ballot drop-off locations so that everything has to be postmarked by election day for it to count. And so we had 6 ballot locations so that if they were voting it on election day, that they didn't have to worry about the post office and whether it was going to be postmarked timely or not. We had bought a lot of PPE equipment that Megan was talking about as well, and some of the issues that she had getting it. But we did get a lot of supplies, masks, gloves, hand sanitizers to make sure about it. Once again, we are a state that does not typically vote by mail. Our absentee ballots are roughly in the 6% range. And so now to change, to go ramp up to this, we had to do a massive public education program for it. And, we did about 5.5 million ads 6 days before the election day across Facebook, all the social media accounts. It was a challenge for us and for the locals, but basically, local election officials always seem to get the job done. I mean, that's what we're tasked to do. This is it. You have to go and do it, and with the resources that you have. So it was quite a challenge. But you can kind of ramp up an absentee ballot program to a vote by mail process. It's not ideal, but in these situations, we all come together and push through it. We do have some other features here, which was to help this along, and it was quite fortuitous for us, which was we had just passed in our shortened legislative session prepaid postage. So the vote by mail was all prepaid postage, which I think helped as well. We do have a tracking system, like in Oregon there, for voters to look up to see where their ballot is in the process, whether it was mailed to them and all the way to it was received with us as well. Right now, we are gearing up for our June primary, which was normally scheduled for April 28th, but it was moved. It includes the presidential preference all the way through a lot of local races as well. Most notably, Baltimore City's mayoral race is a highly contested race for us. We have about 3.5 million ballots that are being mailed out, and we do have limited in-person voting on election day as well. We're going to have 42 vote centers, and this is for the disabled community, for provisional voting, same-day voter registration, and so there will be some limited voting again across the state, which would be about 42. And we're going to have 66 ballot drop-off locations again, due to the fact that the vote by mail ballots have to be postmarked by election day. So if you chop it in your mailbox on election day, it may or may not be timely, because you don't know when the post office will pick it up and postmark it. So if it's on those days, we always recommend people going to the drop boxes. And they were very popular too. People like to drive around there, drop it off. I think it kind of almost was akin to something to do like on election day or early voting, where they would go to a physical location to vote a ballot. So I think that's why they were there. And we are getting more PPE supplies for this election going forward. Some of the challenges, of course, are the canvas part of it as well, because you have to have remote access to the canvas because of all the restrictions here. And the other challenges that we're seeming to face now for candidates as we gear up towards the general election here are for independent candidates, petition candidates, and ballot referendum questions that they want to go forward with it, because the petition gathering process right now is at a standstill. So we've had a lot of issues brought in front of our board. We have limited authority as to what we can do. Most of them where we're trying to require lower signature thresholds, as other states have done. But our board could not lower the threshold, and some of these thresholds are constitutional based. So it's not even statutory. But we did allow for digital signatures in the petition process so that these candidates and ballot issue groups can go out there and do remote petition efforts here so that they can engage voters at that time there through digital signatures. And we've made some pronouncements as to how that would work, which was more of an affirmative action by the individual typing in their name rather than just having a checkbox. A couple of other issues that a vote by mail situation that occurred besides the issues facing the local boards and the administration was a lot of candidates really wanting to know when ballots would be mailed. I think that was important to them. We were open about how this would occur because they want to make sure we're so used to, or the campaigns are so used to having in-person voting. They know election day, they know when early voting is. This has now changed their dynamic. So they needed to have more information about this as well. So it was definitely a give and take process between the administration as well as to make sure that the candidates are informed so that they can then alter their campaign strategies. They wanted to make sure that their mail pieces were hitting prior to the ballots being mailed there so that people can be informed at that time there. Because there's a lack of campaigning that is actually going on now. There is no real events because of all the social distancing rules. So those issues have come to the forefront. It's also interesting to see how the campaigns now had a lack of fundraising problems going on here because of COVID and all the high unemployment and the fact that everyone is focusing on different issues here, that they weren't as local candidates weren't fundraising as they normally would or building up rallies. So it has definitely some interesting problems that were being adjusted to, but it all can be done. And it seems that we did have an election that was successful and went forward with it. For a lot of people, this was their first time voting via a vote by mail process, and we were happy with the results of how many did not, I guess, have technical problems with it. And I think that was due to our public education campaign out there, making sure that people were signing the back of the envelope and dating it, making sure that everything was correct on that front. And I think that's important because there's the lack of interaction with an election official. When you have a question on early voting or when you're at the polling place, you can always just turn around and ask an election judge there. With a vote by mail process, you don't have that interaction. So you have to make sure that you use the available resources at your disposal, which is social media, making sure that it's up to date, as well as ads and everything. So I think overall it was a quite successful election here, and we move forward with it. It has some other challenges, especially in the campaign finance world as well, especially because we have complaints that coming in, and it's difficult to do more investigations because you can't bring them in and have an in-person. You have to do more Zoom calls, and it shows that you have to use technology in new ways, and you adapt to the situations here. And this is something that I think as we go forward, it's shown us new ways to do processes, and I think ultimately has benefited us in a sense. But I think with that, I'll kind of conclude my remarks here and open up for more questions.
Thank you, Jared. We have a number of questions that have been sent in, but before we get to those, and I know some of you have been answering them online, which is great. So we're a bit ahead of the game, but I wanted to ask a general question to any or all of you, which is one of the concerns that has run through all of this from my standpoint is what happens when you significantly decrease the traditional number of polling places in a place. I know we saw it in Milwaukee, so Megan can certainly address. I mean, a lot of this is going to be necessary, unfortunately, as Nate said. I think it was Nate who said that the average poll worker age is 65 to 70, and if that's so, those are people who are very sensitive to the pandemic and probably don't want to leave their houses very much, much less go to a polling place and have interactions with dozens, if not hundreds, of people. So. I think that it's an interesting question, like whether Oregon has polling places at all. And if so, how are they located and what are they used for and who uses them? So I'll open that to anybody who wants to answer.
Well, I'll answer that. We don't have any polling places because we don't need them, but we do have county clerk's offices where anyone with a disability or anyone who wishes to have a private place to fill out their ballot may do so. So we have way, smaller numbers. We have 36 counties, so we have offices in each of the counties, but we don't have polling places. Because we have a primary coming up this next Tuesday, however, we have a lot of information about the very subject you mentioned, and we have cut way back on the number of hirings for the people that actually have to go work in the county offices during the election. We're down in Multnomah County from 250 to 150, so we can do the social distancing. And we also are hiring, frankly, younger people who are less vulnerable. And the good news is, although it's bad news, that there's lots of people who are looking for work. And so it hasn't been difficult, apparently, in Multnomah County, which is Portland, to find people to help out.
Very interesting. So, so anybody who wants to go in person anywhere would have to go to their county clerk's office. And is there language assistance there, Ellen?
Yes, there is. And we have an amazing number of languages available on both online and in person. Obviously, we're not going to have everyone available there, but we will arrange for it completely. Yes. And we also have the kiosks or the boxes to drop your ballots off. We don't have assistants at the boxes other than to point to it and say, this is where you drop your ballot. But you don't have to put your ballot in the mail at all. Now that it's free, the postage, that helps. But because of the concern about the deadline, we tell people, please don't mail your ballot in the US mail after this Thursday, which of course would be tomorrow, just for fear that it might not arrive on time. But as a general matter, up to this point, the Postal Service has been very reliable.
Can I just say,
Nate, you look as if you had something to say.
Yeah, I just want to, because your question was actually quite broad in that, you should think about the polling place consolidation phenomenon as being a sort of both a push and a pull, in that you're going to have some consolidation of polling places that is desirable from a resource allocation standpoint, because if you end up with 2/3 of the voters moving to vote by mail, you want to make sure that the polling places that you do have available are actually going to be for voters that are going to use them. And so if you've got a fixed amount of money and you know that 2/3 of the voters are going to be voting by mail, well, then naturally you're going to consolidate polling places. But then there's the kind of supply side problems, which is that there are some polling places that simply are not suitable to maintain social distancing, and so that some of them are going to be taken out of commission, either by the election officials that don't think they can be safe voting can't occur there, or by the facilities themselves, where they don't want, for example, people coming through. You know, you have the average poll worker is confronted by 700 voters on election day, and they may think that this particular facility is not suitable to that. So, for example, senior living centers, which are often used for polling places, many of them are going to be taken out of commission. One thing that's critical is that the schools remain open, because they're the most ubiquitous polling places and often have the amount of space that is necessary. But depending on where you are in the country, schools are deciding to close. Then there's the last point, which you were making and also came up with respect to Wisconsin, which is, well, even if you have several polling places that are safe and available in your inventory of polling places to run the election, you have to make sure you have enough people to staff them, right? And so the number of polling places you open is going to be a function of the number of people you have who can actually oversee the polling places. That's where the decisions about the National Guard come in, recruiting younger poll workers, and the like. And so we need to make sure that jurisdictions have enough time to plan so they know how many people they can rely on who can then staff the polling places in November.
Well, that leads actually to another question, which is someone asked, how much time do states have to finalize their election plans? When do the final decisions about the November election procedures have to be made? And obviously the election officials on the call would have some views and some answers about that. I know, Jared, just to ask you, how quickly did the Maryland election totally shift gears to an all-male election, the one in late April?
So the order came down in mid-March to do the April election mail at that point there. So it was a very tight turnaround, roughly, a month and a half or so. But, it was already planned. We had some of the MOVE Act and the federal laws that were already in place. So things were already in process with everything that was moving forward for this election here. But we had to gear up, procure those drop boxes because we did not have them. We had to make sure we had different locations then for our vote centers. So yes, it was a very, very tight turnaround there. We were fortunate in a sense that it was just 500,000 voters, and it was a CD. It was just a congressional district race, general, rather than a full blown on primary for the entire state, which is what we're doing now. So we had a nice little, we got through, we had some lessons learned from the process and move forward with it for the June 2nd primary now.
Now, can I ask one follow-up question to that? And that is, did you say that there was a 32% turnout in the congressional race? That
Yes, we had 30.
Low.
For a special congressional race, special elections are usually not high turnout events to begin with here. So we'll have to take a look at it. But yes, that was the turnout rate. Okay.
I guess we need to ramp that up. I hope your June number's better than that. But I guess
I think so.
It's a common problem. I mean, when people, and I was actually going to ask Ellen this, whether there was a big public education transition period when vote by mail just came in, as a uniform statewide process.
Well, we'd been really having vote by mail for almost 20 years before that. I think we were the first in the country to have a statewide senatorial election by mail. That was when Ron Wyden was elected in the mid-90s. So we had been educating people over the years to the concepts of vote by mail. And by the time 2000 came around, it's sort of like marijuana. We were pretty ready for it. if you know what I mean. You're just like, it's okay.
It's okay.
So what's
It's
the
an end
big
of the day
deal,
Wednesday.
right? Anyways, Oregon's a little different, but we do have something called VEO, which is Voter Education and Outreach, and you can go on our website, and it's really wonderful. It makes it, so easy for people to understand what to do. Here's an example right here. I'm sorry I don't have a slide of it, but it's called Follow These 6 Steps. And it just kind of tells people, how it works, and very, look, there's a lot of people who, obviously 8th graders don't vote, but if you put everything into 8th grade language, it makes it possible for all of us to understand it. And we as older individuals do a better job in our writing if we do that. So just keep it basic, straightforward, have colorful charts like we do here, and let people know why it's important and how it has value for them, and that they can get together with their friends and their family and talk about the election, talk about the races, and not, they obviously still fill their ballot out individually, but it makes for more educated voters, more civic oriented process. It's really a win-win when it comes to the education side of it. It's great for teachers, and we have a whole program called the Classroom Law Project that's all about making sure that young people understand what voting is about. And then by the time they start out, of course, if they live here, they don't ever know anything else. They didn't know about polling places. Polling places are kind of an antiquated, cute concept here in Oregon.
Yeah, I'm old-fashioned enough that I think that it's a wonderful institution, but that's because that's what I was used to. That, it's a sort of communal event. But anyway, let me go on. Aside from my personal comments,
you can make it a
Jacqueline,
communal event. You can make vote by mail a communal event, is what I'm saying.
Okay. A few questions about voting in Indian country, because there were a few things that you said that sort of made my ears prick up. One was about language assistance with mail ballots. Is there any possibility, and this is probably true more generally, that you could have someone in your home who could help you with the language? That, if there is someone in the much older generation on the Navajo land and had a younger person in their home who could help translate the ballot that may be in a Navajo language to English. Is that permissible?
A Navajo elder is not going to have an address on their home. That's going to be the bottom line. They are not receiving their ballot in their home. I think that would be elders across Indian country are the ones that are living in these very rural areas. They're the ones that aren't going to be able to pick up their ballot from their house. So they're also the ones that really enjoy going to the polls. They're the ones that go to the polls with frequency and have in-person language assistance. And there may be some people that live with younger people that can help them translate, but I can't say with certainty that that's always the case. And especially now, as everybody's trying to stay away from elders to the extent possible, given the outbreak.
And are there plans for in-person polling places on Indian reservations right now, and are accommodations being made for the virus, or we're not quite in that planning stage yet?
Yeah, so for example, in New Mexico, they recently tried to move to all vote by mail, but the court rejected that move. And I know some counties officials are working with tribes to maintain their in-person polling places. Unfortunately, given the decentralized nature of elections, it's kind of up to the county official to reach out to tribes and accommodate and provide that in-person polling location. Sometimes that's where NARF steps in. If, for example, that accommodation is not made, and we try and increase pressure so that all Native Americans have access, and we'll continue to do that through this election to ensure that all Native Americans have access.
Yeah, I was going to ask you something about that too, when you're talking about the county election officials and their relationship with the tribes. I would think that that one pressure point might be trying to get outreach by the county election officials to do registrations and or do signature collection just the way, you know, particularly I remember Georgia, but I know it happened in lots of places that once horrible ID, very strict ID rules came into play, that they would have mobile units that would go out to, they were sued, of course, first, but they would have mobile units that would go out to communities and make sure that people had IDs or were given IDs or, you know, could arrange for them so that they wouldn't have to go, again, it's to a Department of Motor Vehicles 55 miles away.
Yeah, or 130 miles away.
Yeah,
but really, I think that unfortunately, county officials can just really vary. And I think in terms of their relationship with the tribes. So it's a really local relationship. And I think it would actually be a little bit shocking to the average American to know that sometimes in counties, which are border towns to Native Americans, the relationships are very poor. And by that, I mean overt racism occurs in and through county officials throughout Indian country. And I can say that with certainty because over the past 2 years, NARF and I co-led a series of field hearings across Indian country where we collected input from people that told stories of treatment from elections officials. For example, in Crow Creek, in South Dakota, one county official assigned tribal members a repurposed chicken coop as a voting location, where they could, which you know is obviously unacceptable. And those types of actions in modern America are unacceptable. But that relationship means that sometimes it's not an option to sort of just have an open communication. And so, you know, I think tribes are receptive to having increased access on reservations. They want to have consultation. They want to designate places where they can have polling locations and have Native poll workers so that they don't have outsiders coming in during this really vulnerable time. And so it's a complicated situation. And there are some also, I will say, county officials that are wonderful, that work openly with tribes and that try to increase access and do sort of those novel solutions like mobile voter registration. I had mentioned New Mexico earlier. The Secretary of State there has an amazing Native American task force, and they try a lot of novel solutions to try and increase outreach as well.
Great.
Estelle, can I add something to a previous answer?
Yes.
Hi. So I wanted to just remind folks that in a vote by mail state, the election takes place over the course of almost 3 weeks, right? So what that means is election day is still election day, but the ballots come out, 20 days in advance, and the county clerk's offices are open and available for anyone who wants to come in and cast their vote there at the county clerk's office and receive help with language, help with if they have any disabilities, whether it's visual, hearing, language, etc. And so in a pandemic, it's an ideal situation because you don't have everyone having to arrive on the same day with the issues relating to social distance and not having enough staff. You have the staff over the course of the 3-week period. So even someone coming from Indian country, obviously it's a big schlep, I understand that, but it would be possible to have that individualized attention, and anyone in Indian country can obtain a ballot through a post office box and could hopefully find a way to pick that up. And if they needed help, to find a clerk's office where they could go in person. So, and same for anyone who's a homeless individual. I'm not, I don't want to sugarcoat it. I know these are difficult scenarios, and especially if you haven't experienced it before, it sounds a little weird. But when it's the normal, I just want to be sure that you understand how it works and that there's that 3-week period.
So that leads me to a question that was directed specifically to you, which is, you mentioned that people experiencing homelessness in Oregon can have their mailing address be the county clerk's office. Are there any ID requirements so that when you pick up your ballot, they can be sure you're you?
Very minimal. You do have to have some kind of way of identifying that it is that you are the person that's connected to the ballot that you requested, but it can be your social security number, for example, and that is something that is generally more readily available than a driver's license or other types of ID, passport and such.
Megan, let me ask you a question about timing of things. I mentioned a question before of how much time do states have to finalize their plans. Tell us what the time turnaround was when the courts battered you all around in Wisconsin. In other words, I know there were 2 court decisions the night before the election. So did you have to scramble to get it right then, or had you been planning for a while?
Well, I mean, none of these things were things we could have possibly anticipated happening. I mean, we have no idea, you know, what was going to happen with signature requirements, what was going to happen with the deadlines. And so there was no way to communicate it beforehand because I couldn't have dreamt up the scenarios that kind of came our way. It was, you know, just not something we could have done. But I will say in terms of preparation for November, you know, another thing is that we have ballots out for an election every single day in 2020. So our next statewide election is in August, and that ballots go out for in June. And so there is no time to change the process because the elections are underway, ballots are out, and they will stay out the whole year. Our first ballots went out on January 2nd because we have a statewide in February. And so elections are constantly happening. And so, you know, fortunately and unfortunately, we're kind of good at change. In Wisconsin especially, there's always litigation, legislation, something happening that's changing things at the last minute. And so I think we've tried to develop relationships with community groups, with people that can reach out to folks within their communities to make sure when there are changes that they can communicate it well, but it's certainly not a perfect system. So in terms of planning, I will always take any extra time added to us, but you know, all of the kind of been asked of us. So oftentimes we're told, well, just go to vote by mail. Well, our law doesn't allow that. And so the legislature would have to take that up and decide whether or not they want to change the law. And then of course it would have to pass the governor's desk. And then it would have to pass the gauntlet of litigation as well. And so, you know, we just have to, I guess, try to adapt to whatever comes our way and to try to build resilient elections that don't have a lot of dependencies on specific things, so that if we have to change, that we're able to do so. Because I think, you know, as it goes, if there's one thing that's certain, it's change, especially in elections and especially in Wisconsin.
Nate, do you have any general comments on what might happen if, for example, the landscape of the virus changes completely between now and November? And whether I always have this nightmare that, you know, we're going to have all these accommodations made and we're going to be as set as we can possibly be set. And then, you know, social distancing will look like a cakewalk, that like nobody can leave their house. And then people who can't vote by mail or who have difficult mail service are just out of luck.
Well, you know, most election officials are planning for, you know, sort of the best and worst case scenarios here. The thing that worries me, and I think Megan hinted at this earlier, is that we cannot have every election jurisdiction in the country making the same decision at the exact same time in August, because the supply chain for election and other sort of health-related equipment that's necessary to pull off this election will not be able to sustain the kinds of demands that could be made if these decisions are made quite late. So all of what Megan referred to with the sanitizer and protective equipment and the like, but as well as even the paper that's necessary for mail ballots and mail ballot envelopes, right? These are, generally speaking, right, you need a few months to prepare for all of this, and we need to make sure that those procurement decisions are made right now. Now, I have no crystal ball as to what the virus is going to look like in the fall. One thing that concerns me is if we start opening up or if people start being complacent in June and July, where things seem to be going okay, then if it comes back in full force in September, if people have made assumptions based on life being closer to usual in June or July, then, you know, if we go back to extreme social distancing in the fall, then there's going to be, you know, much greater move to vote by mail. Now, as I said, that I mean, these are surmountable problems, right? If we dedicate the resources that are necessary to deal with them, right? That's one of the reasons Congress has to provide extensive and substantial support to the states and localities to make sure that they can adapt. As I showed you with South Korea was able to actually run an election under what seemed like pretty extreme circumstances, and we should assume that the virus will be in November when it is like today, and so therefore you just have to make the assumptions that you have to have voting under with social distance and to make sure to move as many people to the mail balloting system as possible. Someone in the chat asked about the stresses on the postal system, and that's kind of, you were hinting in that direction as well. You know, election officials right now who do not have a extensive experience in working with their local post offices need to talk to them immediately, because there's, you know, special rules for election-related mail. There are, you know, some mail gets a postmark, some mail doesn't, right? You need to make sure that you understand the different rules and have a relationship with the Postal Service. So I think that, you know, election officials are planning for conditions to be like they are right now, but they're hoping for the best. And, you know, none of us really knows whether there'll be therapies and vaccines and the like that any of which could be rolled out in time for the election.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from somebody who is a voter in Florida, and I'm going to answer it because I've actually done some election work in Florida. They mentioned that there are so many irregularities and problems in voting in Florida, which I can attest to. Every election, there's something. That they feel much more secure voting at a polling place than doing anything by mail. And I'm wondering, in the states that have done by mail, either for a long time or, well, a long time or recently, whether you've had those concerns from people that they're just more comfortable voting at a polling place and they want that option available to them. Anyone?
Well, I think that, so in Maryland, for example, the special election initially was not to have any vote centers whatsoever due to the pandemic. But there was a push to have vote centers to allow for in-person voting for the special general, as well as for the June 2nd primary election. And I think it's just that people do like to have that as a security blanket, as something that they know and trust, versus having an all-mail election 100%. So, you know, the State Board in Maryland, you know, looked at the information as provided from, you know, the health officials and made a decision to have only 3 in-person voting locations, 1 in each of the counties in the congressional district for the special general, and allow for 1 to 4 voting centers in each county for the June 2nd primary, which makes it up to 42 vote centers altogether throughout the state. So it's still, I would say, prevalent that people like election day. I think it's, especially if you're used to it, there's a commotion, there's a camaraderie about it, and you know, it's tough to force to go 100% vote by mail. Additionally, I think that, you know, it allows for disabled voters to have access to machines and to vote independently, and you know, allow for same-day voter registration individuals as well to come in there. So I think you have to have a balance between everything that goes on here, between, you know, vote by mail. I think in this situation here, our public education campaign has always been vote by mail, vote safe, vote, you know, it's secure, but you're always going to have some that need to vote in person or just want to.
Right. So this is actually related very much to another question we had, which is from someone in Utah. Utah is not as well known as a all vote by mail state, but it is. And she says, we have found here in Utah that there must also be accessible in-person polling places beyond just the county's clerk's office for the exact reasons that Jacqueline de León laid out. In order for counties to respond to disability, rural, and language concerns, there must be accessible in-person polling options throughout each county. Often in the larger rural counties, it can be as much as a 6-hour round trip to make it to the county clerk's office. So Jacqueline, you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I'll just echo what she said in that that's absolutely the case. So in San Juan County, I know that it was a 6-hour round trip in Utah to get to the county clerk office. They tried to move to all vote by mail and eventually came to a settlement because they knew that Native Americans would be widely disenfranchised under that system. And I think that just having county seats as the fallback will inevitably lead to Native Americans being disenfranchised. One, because they're not comfortable interacting with counties, and two, because it's often logistically impossible for them to get there on an election, during an election cycle. My presentation didn't include sort of the disheartening poverty statistics that are pervasive throughout Indian country, but lack of transportation is one of the primary indicators of poverty. And so not having a reliable vehicle to travel, even if it's only 30 miles, not having a reliable vehicle to travel those 30 miles and not having the money to pay for gas, getting to a county seat is going to be an insurmountable hurdle for many Native Americans.
Yeah, and this is actually something I've been thinking of too, to broaden it out, that, you know, not coincidentally, the very communities that have been most negatively affected by the coronavirus are also the communities that are often most negatively affected by voting changes, where they're just mostly not thought about. And I think that, you know, that we also have to be aware of that when new rules are being written for this election. Anybody else want to jump in? We've got some questions. I think we've covered almost every. Oh, here's one. How will the homeless in Maryland vote? How do homeless in Maryland vote, Jared?
So homeless, they can go in-person voting. That's why we have that there as well. And, you know, when they're registered to vote, the homeless do provide some sort of address, whether it's the shelter or anything. So they have the ability to vote. There's options for the homeless to vote.
So would they get ballots in the mail at the shelter?
If that's their address that they were registered at, yes.
There have been states where they say you can use an address that, as long as it denotes where you are, which might be, you know, under the freeway overpass at exit 16.
Well,
that is true. So I think, yeah,
you
I
can
think
also,
we do have some of those.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here, you can also, as I indicated earlier, pick up your ballot at the county clerk's office if you prefer, if you don't have an address that the U.S. Postal Service is likely to deliver to. But we do, as part of our education and outreach, we do reach out to the homeless to make sure that they understand, and we'll go wherever they are to make sure that they understand what the process is. And again, because we have the 3-week period of voting, we can be very helpful one-on-one to anyone who wants to, who's having any kind of difficulty obtaining their ballot once they've requested one. So there's just a lot more flexibility. There's a lot more opportunity during the election span. It's not a one-day election. And if you love the voting, if you love going to the polls and you love the camaraderie, think about the camaraderie that you can have every day for 3 weeks, teaching your children what a ballot is, showing it to them, talking to your friends about what they think about the particular measures. We have, as I said earlier, lots of measures on our ballots in addition to individual candidates. It's like an absolute love fest for people who love elections. So the idea when you go, I mean, I remember going to the polls and I remember going with my parents and kind of hanging out, and it was really exciting. But honestly, I think you learn a lot more and you have more potential for understanding what it is you're voting for or against if you have the opportunity to be more deliberate about it. So yes, you'll miss out on the polling places. And I'm absolutely, Jacqueline, again, I don't want in any way to be dismissive of your point about the distances, and I'm going to be looking into that. Oregon has 9 recognized tribes and an additional 30,000 individuals who self-identify as Native American. So very concerned about that issue. Obviously, Washington is doing a lot too. So if there's any takeaway for me, and there's lots, but that is probably the biggest one at this session, is to make sure that we're looking out for our Native Americans who are so deserving of the right to and the ability to vote.
Nate, is there any functional difference between vote by mail and no excuse absentee voting?
Yes, well, so it sort of depends who's using the terms, but generally speaking, when we think of vote by mail or vote by mail states, we're thinking of Oregon and Washington, Colorado, Utah, Hawaii, now, by the way, California for this election. But these are where the jurisdiction mails ballots to the voters without them having to request it. So and then the absentee voting states, the voter has to request it, and that's a pretty big difference that then leads to, you know, a significant drop off in the number of people who request absentee ballots. I should say, even between those two options, and of course, you've already mentioned that there are some states where you have to have an excuse in order to have an absentee ballot. One of the things that we're seeing this time is that COVID, the existence of the virus, right, could provide a kind of uniform excuse for even those states that require an excuse. So you say, I just don't want to vote.
A couple of states have actually done that by executive order or something of that.
And so even what is an excuse absentee ballot under these circumstances is becoming a little bit blurred. But from the map that you could see in my presentation, right, that most of the places that are all vote by mail are obviously in the West, and then we've seen this shift to no excuse absentee balloting, particularly in the North. And then you still have some places, particularly in the South and the center, that require an excuse. I wanted to raise one other thing that often doesn't come up in the many panel discussions that we have on this topic these days, which is that elections, the impact of COVID on the election affects more than just voting and the actual planning of the process of voting. So all of the ancillary activities that accompany an election, including voter mobilization and voter contact and the like, are affected by the virus. And so whether it's the campaigns, having poll workers who would go out and knock on doors, or the signature gathering efforts and other kinds of voter communication, all of these are affected by the virus. They affect the lives of the election officials, who sometimes have to do more than just what they can do from Zoom rooms and over the internet. And so in an election like this, the online tools provided by Facebook, Google, the Voter Information Project and the like, and the tools that are used to contact voters through cell phones and the like become even more important, because you don't have those kind of in-person mobilization tactics that are prevented by social distancing.
Thank you. I think we've come almost to the end of our time, so I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank you all, you audience, for joining the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. I'm going to have to do this again. The Standing Committee on Election Law, the Coalition for Racial and Ethnic Justice, and the section of State and Local Government Law for this webinar. We'd also like to express our gratitude to a really fine group of panelists. You are all doing such critical work, and we thank you for taking the time to join us and share your experiences. The Civil Rights and Social Justice section provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We hope this helps you in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA. We also hope you consider making a charitable gift to the section to support our work. And if you want to do that, you can do it at ambar.org, that's ambar.org/donate-CRSJ. And you can find information on other free programs on the webpage. Finally, please stay safe and healthy, and please vote. Thank you very much. We appreciate your participation.
Thank you.